Okay, on behalf of the Princeton Environmental Institute, I want to welcome you, and especially our guests here. I'm Jenny Price. I'm the Barron Visiting Professor of the Environment and Humanities here at PEI, and this is the second of our three-part series, What Arts and Humanities Are Good For. The premise of this series is that the humanities and the arts have, as some people have already heard me say, superpowers to address environmental issues, and that we need engineers, and we need policymakers, and we need scientists, but we also need historians and literary scholars if we're going to address problems successfully, the problems we're all really worried about, like climate change, and food distribution, and drought, and these urgent environmental issues. So if you are worried about climate change, you are in the right place. We have three panels. We already did last week. We did what history is good for. And then this week is not next week, but the third piece of the series, which is going to be November 13th, is what arts are good for. And today we're going to talk about what literature and literary analysis are good for. So we have three people who are extraordinarily well positioned to answer this question, what is literature good for? I'll just introduce them in order in which they're going to speak. I'm trying to keep my intro brief because we want to leave lots of time for you. So Stephanie LeMenager is the Moore Professor of Literature and Environment at the University of Oregon, and she's really been a key voice. We're really excited to have her here to talk about the relevance of the humanities. She's the founder of the new Environmental Humanities Journal, Resilience, which the digital journal, Resilience, which I hope you all check out, which puts environmental humanities at the center of our conversations about our ecological future. Her new book, Living Oil, Petroleum Culture in the American Century, shows us that we have to think really hard about the embeddedness of oil in American culture and identity if we want to transition to more sustainable energy sources. So we're going to have to think about what that new culture might look like. And she's working on a new book called Weathering, which I want to hear more about, on the significance of literature in the era of climate change. Nixon, and if you're familiar with, was here with us in the spring, and has come back. He's the Rachel Carson and Elizabeth Princeton Professor of English at the University of Wisconsin-Madison. He is a writer and a literary scholar, and he writes frequently. He's written frequently for the New York Times. He's written for the New Yorker and the Atlantic, etc. And his most recent book, which I think is still winning prizes, called Slow Violence and the Environmentalism of the Poor, is this really powerful, both an argument and a model for the importance of literature and literary analysis in the 21st century. And he's working on a new book called The Anthropocene, A Concise History of an Epical Idea, which I think speaks for itself. And then our own Bill Gleason is the chair of the English department here, and he is the author of The Leisure Ethic, Work and Play. Can everybody hear, by the way? It's okay? Okay, Work and Play in American Literature, and Sights Unseen, Architecture, Race, and American Literature, both of which look at the key role that literature and language play in social and cultural shifts in American history. And his new book is an edited book, Keywords in the Study of Environment and Culture. I know Bill is a really warm and really generous colleague, without whom this series probably wouldn't be happening. He's been really important to everything that's going on this fall. And his talents and generosity are no secret. He teaches the most popular course, this is right, in the university? Isn't that great? The most popular course in the university is an English course, and it's on children's literature. And he's an affiliate faculty in 4 programs, also the McGraw Center for Teaching and Learning, the varsity baseball team, which is very Princeton, the baseball team has a faculty advisor, and Rockefeller College. I want to just sneak a few thank yous in. I've done much more extensive thank yous last week, so I won't do them again, but I want to personally thank PEI, and then on behalf of PEI, I want to thank our 10 co-sponsors across the campus, which is really pretty extraordinary, and also the support. Thank Tom and Curry Barron for the support that makes it all possible. So here's how it's going to all work. We're not going to talk as much as you might think we're going to talk. I've asked each of our panelists to speak for 10 minutes, absolute maximum, to address this question, what is literature good for? So each of them are going to do that. Then we're going to give ourselves a chance to riff with each other, just if we want to, if anybody wants to do that. And then Lars Hedin, the chair of EEB, Ecology and Evolutionary Biology, is going to throw out the first question. We'll deal with that. And then my students are going to throw out the next question. We'll deal with that. And then hopefully we'll still have about 30 minutes left for discussion. And we're going to run, just so you know, we're going to run the discussion less as a Q&A than a real audience discussion. So it'll be less a sort of first come, first serve than really trying to build a discussion with you all. And I'm going to turn it over to Stephanie.
So, as Jenny so kindly has told you, I'm Stephanie LeMenager, and I want to thank Jenny for her incredible dynamism and intuitive approach to environmental humanities, which has been an inspiration for me since the late 1990s. So thank you for that, Jenny, and thank you for inviting me. What's literature good for, you might ask? Well, one, possibility space. About a year ago, Elizabeth Colbert gave an interview on her book, The Sixth Extinction, to the New Yorker out loud, where she emphasized that what's happening now in regard to extinction rates, in part related to global climate change, is, quote, a no analog situation for humanity. Not for Earth, but for humanity. No analog situation is a term we typically associate, Colbert told us, with the scientific literature. But with a similar recognition that nothing like this has happened before, humanist scholars are looking for analogs in literary genres, patterns of narrative expectation that might address the multi-scalar, multiply-sided, and differentially timed unfolding of global climate change. What's literature good for, we ask? We ask this at this precipitous moment on the edge of policy, climate. The most fundamental answer for some is that literature gives shape to even unprecedented times. We might summarize this function of literature as scenario design, and I'm going to talk about that in relation to what I'm calling possibility space. Scenario design, whether conceived by a software designer, an architect, or literary critic, works in a way that literature always has done. It offers the reader or user a possibility space that opens diverse roles and pathways we might experience through virtually embodied and thoughtful play. Associated with speculative fiction in literary studies and with utopian design and architecture, scenario design offers a way of affirming the possibility that things could be otherwise. Its various scenarios and conceits less often about the future as such than about the present estranged from itself and opens to new potentialities. In the Cli-Fi novel Odds Against Tomorrow, which some of you might have read by Nathaniel Rich, Rich plays with the idea of literature as possibility space, offering up an anti-hero who, in the face of climate disaster, a disaster somewhat like Hurricane Sandy, leaves professional risk analysis and the paradigm of insurance for inconclusive but vibrant possibilities. The ending of the novel is unsatisfactory precisely because it is so inconclusive, but that's also its strength, I would argue. Storytelling has been itself a kind of insurance for human animals, a means of anticipating risk and mitigating its possible effects. As Brian Boyd writes in his study of fiction as evolutionary adaptation, quote, the ability to imagine a world as other than it is underpins pretend play, and the ability to conceive of alternatives underpins all modeling. Free thought needs alternatives, counterfactuals. Fiction offers incentives and practice and thinking beyond the here and now. Consider, for example, the Future Coast Project out of Columbia University in partnership with the NSF, where participants archive voicemails from the later 21st century, which are microfiction, where, for instance, a small child calls her grandmother and asks her if she will take her to see the last living lobster, or a hotel salesperson hard sells a Hawaiian vacationer on tsunami insurance. Or consider the radio serial podcast We're Alive, which is about zombies in and one that has inspired an incredibly vibrant fan fiction community where tens of thousands of amateur authors have built on this podcast to think about and explore ways of living more sustainably in Southern California. Opening possibility space, our stories cannot save us from any given moment or particular future, but they can allow us and encourage us to be flexible, to avoid rigidity and panic, to continue thinking. Even apocalyptic scenarios are meant to remind readers of the skills that we do possess and of the possibility that we might act differently and better. 2, sociality. Now, because I was teaching Nathaniel Rich and other novelists who are called fly-fi writers, whether I agree with that or not, last year, I found myself in an odd position of fielding questions from reporters from the New York Times and the Climate Wire, which is a journal that typically is about tech and policy questions. What did these journalists want with an English professor like me? They actually interviewed several, I wasn't the only one. Well, partly they wanted to know, what is literature good for? Can it save us from something like climate change? The fact that cli-fi continues to be present in the North American and European and even East Asian news cycles, and maybe more, those are the only ones that I can verify, but it might be elsewhere. The fact that cli-fi is present in these news cycles suggests to me a hunger on the part of some readers, perhaps more privileged readers typically, for the concrete and complicated scenarios that a climate change genre might allow us. Complicated and concrete scenarios where we might experience, if vicariously, other minds, modes of agency, a virtual way of being social or sociality of the climate precipice. It's less interesting to me whether cli-fi is actually a genre than that there seems to be this great desire to call it one. And I think that desire is fundamentally a social desire. It's a desire to hail and aggregate a certain kind of public, to bring a public together around the question of our planetary moment. Perhaps another reason that journalists are interested in climate fiction is because they have been writing literature about climate change for quite a long time and have not necessarily seen as vocal a public respond to that as we would wish. To answer the question, what's literature good for, it's important to consider nonfiction literatures, including journalism. Nonfiction literature is everywhere and therefore often taken for granted or called something else. Like fiction, it invokes concrete, complicated relationships for the readers who inhabit. The sociality or way of being social of the new climate includes relationships with non-human others, and traditional journalistic genres have registered that shift in how agency works, on who or what will be at the center, and what kinds of actions might be possible. Case in point, the New York Times ran a special weather section in 2012 about the 43 casualties in New York City proper associated with Hurricane Sandy. Interestingly, this weather section was also an obituary section, but preeminently it was an intimate record of the storm. When the newspaper repositions obituary under the rubric weather, it indicates an interesting, if not heart-stopping, recalibration of what it means to be human and of what makes a life and a death and a memory of growth. Paradoxically, contemporary environmental stories imagine a diminished world that is tipping toward extinction, but at the same time, they tend to imagine a deeply socially networked world, concatenated through communicative trees, internet swarms, and self-conscious non-human animals. It is a story that allows the social to emerge from the scientific knowledge and digital delivery systems that convey information and subtend new modes of communication. 3, memory. You've seen the oceanographer Greg Johnson's haiku project by now, I would assume, where Johnson rewrites the 2,200-page physical science portion of the IPCC Fifth Assessment as a booklet of 19 illustrated haiku. Seattle's environmental think tank Sightline posted the booklet online, and within 2 weeks it had over 40,000 hits. This booklet is now a downloadable PDF and also a YouTube channel, which is used in K-12 schools to teach children about global Ray Johnson, describing this effort, said that haiku as a form, quote, allows me to focus and distill things in a way that the scientific writing he was doing does not. While watercolor gives an immediate presence, physically, visually, viscerally to the science, literature gives knowledge flesh, archiving it as emotion by offering it with sensorial values. To feel knowledge through story is to know its fragility and contingency, but also to know our own capacities for invention and for endurance. Literature, at its most essential, is a mode of sharing attention, being human together, again, the social, feeling and knowing together. It is a vast archive of affective memory that, again, registers in the body sensorially. I have to disagree with an historian, a very interesting historian, who said recently that there is no such thing as feeling ourselves as human beings, as feeling ourselves as a species. I think what he might have meant to say was that writing ourselves into the world is perhaps harder than it has ever been before. But that means that now especially we need stories.
Yeah, thanks so much, Stephanie. I'll pick up a number of threads that Stephanie laid out. First of all, to house an idea in a story is to give it a power that it previously didn't have. And I'm very much of the mind of the novelist Gleason, who she says that to tell a story is in itself an act of hope. The climatologist Mike Hume makes a simple but consequential statement that we live in a world that's both material and imaginative. And it seems to me that trying to better understand and to deepen the relationship between the environmental sciences and an openly interpretive field like literature involves trying to negotiate the space between the material and the imaginative realm. I should say here that two things about myself. First of all, that I teach in a department that is a department of English literature, rhetoric, and creative writing, all fused together. And aspects of those probably color my approach to this subject, because I'm interested in all three facets. Also that my special passion, my drug of choice, is nonfiction, which for a very long time was not really considered literature. Certainly when I did my prelim exams, there was Walden, there was Black Boy, and there were 150 other books of fiction and poetry and drama. But I'm fascinated by public science writing, memoir, essay, travel writing, the elasticity, the versatility of those forms, and the way in which they blend issues of documentation and issues of creative experimentation. So I thought as a channel through this brief time that we've been given, I would focus on the question of intimacy and distance. It seems to me that so many of the biggest environmental challenges and questions of our day involve vast tracts of time, be it accelerated climate change, or even more so the geologic, where we're trying to open the human up into questions of epochs and eras and ages. And in this context, I think there is a powerful impulse to try to temper the potentially dehumanizing character of those time frames. And one of the ways we see this is in the kind of figurative language that occurs when talking about the Anthropocene or talking about climate change. So for instance, over and over again we encounter the idea of looking for the human signature in the fossil record, or we see reports of human fingerprints all over Australia's hottest year on record. To take another sort of almost unimaginably large system, the idea of the invisible hand of the continental image, but a manual image, a physical, anatomized image that brings something that's beyond our grasp into the body itself. As the novelist Kim Stanley Robinson put it, environmentally, the invisible hand never picks up the check. So that's these dormant metaphors that are an attempt, I think, to bring these intimidating timescales down to the body. It's not only hands, we think of wiping species off the face of the earth, like it's a washcloth, makeup. The physical gestures of carbon footprints, deepening carbon footprints, walking up towards the edge of the climate curve. These impulses towards embodiment as an attempt to resituate ourselves in relation, as I say, to these impersonal frames. There's another facet of this that has come to fascinate me, and that's in relation to what we might call speculative nonfiction. Stephanie mentioned some speculative fiction. By speculative nonfiction, I don't mean Ursula Le Guin and Kim Stanley Robinson and Margaret Atwood. I mean works of documentary nonfiction, like public science writing, that have overtly fictive moments in them. And one of those moments that I see recurring again and again is a moment when somebody's writing about trying to narrate predictably off the science, human and planetary futures, but inserts periodically a fictive geologist or a historian gazing back from a century or two from now, or several millennia from now, at the unfolding present and the future that's emerging. So there's this attempt to humanize those expanses of time through a fictive figure. We see this in Elizabeth Colbert's Sixth Extinction, another bestseller, Alan Weisman's The World Without Us, Jan Zelitzvich, who's the pedagogist who's done a lot to promote the idea of the Anthropocene, his book, The World After Us. We see it in Naomi Oreskes and Eric Conway's new book, The Collapse of Civilization, where they station a historian 4 centuries from now in China, looking back at the year 2093, which they figure to be the collapse of the Enlightenment dream in relation to neoliberalism and the failure to act on climate change. So I think these speculative figures within a documentary context also speak to this need to provide some thread of human intimacy across what may otherwise seem like hostile expanses of time. And I think this really speaks to the role of literature in trying to negotiate systemic thinking and translate and transmit and refract it into ways that can produce some kind of emotional traction. And it's as well to remember that in this context that all the great social struggles have been fought out on the terrain of story, amongst other terrains. If you think of the emancipation or civil rights movement or women's suffrage or anti-apartheid movement, decolonization, marriage equality, all of them have had to have involved negotiating among competing storylines and finding ways to energize certain storylines as opposed to others. And I think that's very much the case in the context of acknowledging and acting upon rapid climate change, as well as trying to think through the manifold consequences of the Anthropocene. And in this way, literature, I believe, has a profound role to play. Thank you.
how I would answer this question in a slightly different way, and I'm relieved because I knew I'd be going third, and I didn't know if I would just stand up and say exactly what they said. I decided to think about this question pedagogically. So I'm an English professor, and I work in a classroom, and I teach at least 3 different courses here in which literature and how we think about the environment, how we might think about climate change, in some sense come together. I teach a course for American Studies called American Places, which is about the history of the idea of place in American culture. I teach a graduate seminar on architecture and 19th century American literature, which is really about the cultural and social and literary history of architectural forms. And I teach a course called Literature and Environment, which is the one that's probably most directly related to this kind of question. And what I did was think about not just what is literature good for, but what are the tools of the literary critic or the literary historian good for when we're working with students in trying to think our way through literary text toward questions about global climate change, either now or if we're thinking about how they took shape in a previous era, even in an era in which we didn't have this concept, but which might inform the way we think about it now. So I'm going to give you 3 classroom examples. 2 are real and 1 is imaginary. That is, 2 are things I've actually done in my classroom, and 1 is something I'm planning to do next spring. All right, so in my literature and environment classroom, what I do on the opening day is ask students if they could define what environment means. What does the term mean? What does it mean to you when you define it? And I should clarify that my class typically has about half the students, to say there are 20 students, half are humanists, half are literature makers, and half are scientists. And so they have to learn how to talk together. And we discover very quickly that they don't have a common definition for this term. The definitions come out of different fields, and that can be helpful. After a little bit of this grappling, what I do is actually, I hand it out, but I show them where this word came from. And I ask them to look at the Oxford English Dictionary. Because one of the things we do as literary critics, one of the things we're trained to do is think about where words come from. Because words and their origins shape the way we think about the actual materials we're talking about. And this is a fascinating exercise because they begin to see that, of course, the environment didn't mean what we mean by the term today when it first emerged. I don't know how well you can read this, but the term comes out of the French. It has to do with surroundings, with being surrounded with the periphery. And then you can see, I've just put a couple of slides together. The earliest definition of environment was the action of circumnavigating, encompassing or surrounding something, or the state of being encompassed or surrounded. And I think you can feel where we get our sense of the environment which is around us from this, but it begins in a different place, and it's helpful for students to think through some of this history. It's only in the second definition that we shift from an action to a place. Beginning in the 18th century, the area surrounding a place or a thing, the environs or the surroundings or the physical context. And it's only in the 19th century that we start thinking about the physical surroundings in which a person or other organism lives. And as we put people and species into place and think about environment, that it has to have things and people in it before we can talk about it. And then it's only in the last of the second definitions, and it's only in the mid-20th century, that we see that environment means what we tend to mean when we use it today, the natural world or physical surroundings in general, either as a whole or within a particular geographical area, especially as affected by human activity. I find that in this class, when we begin here, now these students have a kind of shared, not just a shared vocabulary, but a shared history of the development of the term, and we can now talk together through the rest of the semester. Every time we use the word environment, we ask ourselves what history of that term we're invoking and how it plays into the specific conversation we're having that day. So that's example number 1. Example number 2. Example number 2. About a third of the way through the syllabus, we pause to read a fascinating genre that emerges in the 17th century called, it's called landscape poetry or loco-descriptive poetry. Sometimes it's called country house poetry. This has the status of the first country house poem. And reads like a description. It is a description of a place, of an actual place. This is Sir Philip Sidney, the poet's younger brother's big estate and source. And the poem by Ben Jonson is two answers. It's a gift to the place, and it's a description of the place. One of the things that literature is particularly good at doing is describing things. And one of our tools as literary critics is to think about how description gives us places and how we think it through. We give students this poem. My team teaches this course. We give students this poem. Don't tell them anything about answers. Don't assume they know anything about the little object I just told you. What we ask them to do is draw a picture of what they're seeing when they read the poem. Give them about 5 minutes to draw a pencil sketch. When they're done, we ask them to pass their sketch to the person next to them. And then repeat and repeat until they go all the way around. And it's astonishing. Because the comments start to burble up before you're even finished, because no two drawings look the same. Everyone's decided on a different scale, on a different frame, on which the details actually matter, which go in the center and which don't. And it's a wonderful way of thinking about literature doesn't simply deliver us facts or descriptions of actual places that we then go out and find photographs to match them. Literature gives us a way of representing place that is itself always under interpretation. And in fact, country house poems are deeply political poems. They're poems that are designed to praise the leisure of the country house in contrast to the urban environment. So these poems are deliberately set up to get people thinking about contrasting social and cultural and political. All right. The third example, and again, this is just to put some language up on the board. This is the one that's imagined. I'm planning to try this in the spring. I'm teaching a course on American literature from 1865 to 1930. We don't yet have the concept of global climate change in this period, but I want to teach the course with the environment at the center. I want students to think about the ways in which literature in this period is already starting to think through many of the questions we are thinking about today. The rise of cities, like the tension between city and country. This is an excerpt from a short story written by Charles Chestnut in the late 19th century called Poor Sandy. Sandy's a slave who's tired of being shuttled around the county to work for different slave owners. And his wife, who is a conjure woman, turns him into a tree so that he can stay rooted on their plantation. She can visit him at night. It's down by the swamp. She can turn him back into a person. They can be together. Then turn him back into a tree so he's safe and doesn't have to be sent off to labor. And his plantation owner just chalks him up as missing. One day, Teddy is away from the plantation and comes back to find that the tree has been cut down. And it's been taken to the sawmill to be turned into logs. She runs to the sawmill, hoping to turn him back into a human being before he is cut and milled, and she's there too late. And this paragraph describes her being stopped physically as she runs to try to change him, tied up, and she has to watch him cut into lumber. And it's really a kind of allegory for watching someone in your family be tortured, or in the system of slavery, be flogged, or beaten, or killed under that system. So it's a story about power, about place, about property, about race, and environment. Really, it's an early environmental justice story. And about how these systems within American slavery, long before we have a concept of environmentalism or global climate change, are already thinking about these interrelationships. And I know these relationships matter to students today, so if I can get them to think about these ideas from 100 years ago, then I think we're getting something. And those are some of the things that I think literary critics and literary historians can do with literature in the classroom.
Okay, great. So first I'm going to give folks up here a chance to respond to each other. I have a few thoughts, but do you have any thoughts? You don't have to. Just if you have anything you want to say in response, now's your chance.
I'm happy to just turn it over.
Yeah, I'm kind of curious to see what an open conversation might look like. If that's okay. Well, give to Lars. I'd like to actually make a few comments just because I feel like we've seen really different answers here, and to just kind of try to parse them out so that we're not looking at apples and oranges, because I think they're all connected, but it seems to me, and you can tell me what you think, that Stephanie and Rob are talking yeah, you can't hear? Thank you, Wendy. Okay, yeah, okay. You don't always need a mic in this room, but I don't know. Doesn't feel like it, does it? Yeah. No, I think they're all, okay, I'll just yell. So, they're talking about really the usefulness of stories as knowledge, that stories can be knowledge with more power, usefulness of stories they're really talking about literature, really, to envision future alternatives, to the future, to envision alternative futures, to communicate more powerfully, and to see what's invisible across times and across places. It seems to me that that's the realm of your answers. And then Bill, I think, was talking less about literature, more about literary analysis and literary history, which I think is a slightly different, obviously related, a slightly different set of questions. We were talking about this in my class today. That's more about how using the tools of literary analysis to look at environmental problems and understanding the ways in which, you have to understand how people think through stories, in order to understand how they, say, study and communicate and react to climate change. And then also you have to understand that words and stories have histories. And if you can understand those histories, then it helps us this is what we talked about a lot last week, it helps us get underneath our assumptions about, if you can say, well, environment, you can actually put that word into play. It actually helps you ask questions more, and again, see alternative futures in a way that you can't if you don't understand the history of that thing. So I'm just sort of parsing that. It seems like we have a number of answers, some of which are about the powers of literature, and some of which are about the powers of literary analysis and history. Does that seem?
Yeah, I think they're related. One of the things I realized I didn't say but was in my notes is that last example was also about how literature works through point of view. So literary artists usually pick a point of view, but sometimes those points of view are unstable. And in that particular story, you really get access to at least 5 different points of view. At various times, you're thinking with Sandy, you're thinking with Tenny. This is a story being told to 2 other people by a former slave who lived on the same plantation. So the story actually stages a scene of storytelling and what kind of power it will have. So, I think actually there's a lot of connection here.
No, I see that too. And by the way, my throat is very sore, so if I don't project, my apologies. When I was writing my last book, I was using a lot of different media, and I found that one media form that was particularly useful to me was a set of tours, infrastructure tours, that were conducted by the Center for Land Use Interpretation, which is primarily based out of Los Angeles, though it has other bases as well. The one that I wrote about was one of Houston's oil infrastructure, and particularly the refinery infrastructure at the Port of Houston. And what these tours do is they force you, or I shouldn't say force, they invite you compellingly to inhabit a point of view in a landscape that is almost unreadable. So how do you walk through that landscape and begin to see connections, to begin to see your own possible agency within it, to not simply feel overwhelmed by the kinds of agglomerations of power that big oil represents and that literally are instantiated in this city, this very important international oil city. And it was really easy for me, in a way, to begin. I had to read up on the center and to read up on this kind of conceptual and geographical art as well, but it was easy for me to begin to ask the questions I asked, thinking about, for instance, Henry James on point of view, and Henry James's architectural metaphors for literary texts and for the experiential how should I say, the sort of experiential role we play as readers. So that's one point of connection I see, and I can see others as well, but I'm going to stop talking now so others can speak.
Yeah, well, maybe I'll just pick up on Henry James. I'm glad that you raised this question of perspective, because part of what I'm trying to talk about with speculative nonfiction is, I remember a New Yorker cartoon way back where they had a librarian on a ladder. On the one hand there was truth, on the other hand there was non-truth. And there is, even in the term nonfiction, there's a prejudicial assumption. that it's about spilling information or facts onto the page. And I'm interested in the craft, and that's why the speculative dimension and the aspect of perspective is a very powerful one for me. There's a scene in one of Henry James's novels where he's describing a very ornate French garden. And the writer Jamaica Kincaid contrasts that with a scene in a novel by the Zimbabwean writer Tsitsi Dangaremga called Nervous Conditions, where she has arrived at a boarding school, and she's a young woman from a rural part of Zimbabwe. Nobody in her family has ever been to school before. And at the entrance to the school, there is a garden with canna lilies and so forth. And she's stopped in her tracks, both by the beauty and the improbability of it, and the sense that this isn't the proper way to use land. And she comes from a laboring relationship to the land. And it becomes a very economical, emotional shortcut for her liminal status between coming from the rural laboring class and moving into the educated class, where a garden could be like that, could be beautiful in a way that is taken for granted and therefore unseen. And it interests me that Jamaica Kincaid, who also made a transition from a background in Antigua to being a gardener in Vermont, would pick on those two passages and say they reveal something about the perspective of the person who is describing the garden. A garden isn't just a garden. A garden comes with trappings of what is seen and what is unseen, and how you are positioned by the society in relation to that particular arrangement. Yeah.
Our perspective. So we're going to give Lars the first question, and then my students, and then we'll open it up.
Yeah. So I wanted to point out that I saw actually a lot of links and connections and similarities between what was presented here. And there's a very particular question I want to raise, but let me start with a hypothesis. I'd like to hypothesize that there might be a class of phenomena that are really challenges to the human enterprise that can only be resolved on intergenerational timescales. That's where I want to end up with this question. But let me make a few observations. I thought this was a little bit of my role. So let me start with Bill. In his first classroom exercise, when he had half the students being humanists and half scientists, this is a very traditional thing. We see this all the time, the difficulty of navigating definitions. Instead of environment, if you take the definition of nature, very interesting one. So you have, human part, you have the natural part of nature, right? the part that's non-human, and then you often separate the human part in the long discussions. We always hear this, I think, in the humanities, if I may say, that there's such long discussions like humans inside or outside. I'd like to make another definition here that goes to Rob's idea of intimacy, and that's human nature. And so I'm wondering, I want to make that observation first. And then I want to go then to hold on a minute, to Stephanie's point about possibility space, which I think really is linked to human nature and the needs. Maybe I shouldn't say that, but the question of tools, question of when you challenged the need for cultural transformation. Need is the wrong word, but when your culture is challenged, the question is what are the tools you have? Not on the natural side, not on the human side, but on the human nature side, to explore that. And let's see, so if you think of that as a challenge, so now I come to the question here. So are we talking about the difficulties of navigating cultural transformation? I wanted to just ask you to reflect on your ideas and these ideas a little bit more in a historical perspective. Rob, you did it. You started doing that a little bit. You said you came back to the importance of storytelling and some historical events. So I just made my own list here. I would say 1960s, I would say rock and roll, I would say demographic transition, meaning if you don't know what the demographic transition is, it used to be that we all thought that human population growth is exponential and there's just no stopping to it, but it turns out in fact that there's a natural self-regulation that is at the societal level that happened, started maybe in Italy quite some time ago and in developed countries, and Brazil is just undergoing it with fertility rates lower than in the US. So that's more the scientific. You know, the political revolutions, religious, Martin Luther, Enlightenment, the idea of America. So I'm wondering, these things of cultural transformation, intimacy of human nature, and navigation. That's my question to the three of you.
Okay, I'm going to hold my mic. It's interesting, Lars, that you bring up human nature, because I was writing this book that I may still call Weathering, but what I discovered was undergoing a process of weathering and change and enrichment for me was most centrally the concept of human nature. And I think that there's a movement, you probably know of, called the post-humanities that's been in some ways really generative, because people who describe themselves as post-humanists tend to think a lot about multi-species relationship, about animal consciousness and agency, and can link up with people in the biological sciences, for instance, and write very interesting collaborative work. But what I found that posthumanism is really about is a revisitation of the possibility of human nature as something that might be generative, heuristic, and absolutely necessary right now, in terms of thinking exactly about what it is that we have the capacity to do as a species. I'm not a person who believes that history is going to be somehow always forever after universalized. There's been arguments to that effect, maybe more subtle than that, but read in that way by some historians. But nonetheless, I have been reading a lot of work by people such as Brian Boyd, who have to assume to a certain degree of human nature in order to talk about the capacities for navigating the present and the near future that we have, and the kinds of affordances, again, that our story, our art, even our play give us to think through the most difficult and unprecedented crises. When I think about history, and Rob referred to this actually in his talk, I too think about how many major historical shifts seem to have been played out, if not primarily, at least most publicly, through artistic expression. And like Bill, I began my career anyway in the 19th century. And this is often described as a century of reform, and it's a century in which you see the novel become both a potent version of social panorama, but also a kind of testing ground for radical social ideas. And there, for instance, Harry Beecher Stowe's Uncle Tom's Cabin, a novel that now is, we see as racist in a variety of ways and deeply troubled in a variety of ways, but nonetheless a novel that really had a powerful effect in changing historical consciousness about the meaning of chattel slavery. What kind of techniques did Stowe use? In some respects, she used sampling techniques that aren't that different from the techniques Rachel Carson used in Silent Spring. Is there a way that we can link that up to some of the transmedia storytelling that's happening in activist communities today? I think it's important to think through different media platforms that are now available to us and how they change the shapes of stories. But at the same time, to think through continuities over time about how
publics have been summoned by certain sorts of representational strategies and moved by them. So that's my sort of initial response to what seems to me like a really terrific sort of framing of our discussion. Thank you.
Yeah, maybe I could sort of ground my response in relation to increasing historical awareness of anthropogenic climate change. And it's interesting to me that in the insurance business and the Pentagon, there's not a lot of denialists. We can sort of take that for granted. But there's a lot of discussion about what the most effective rhetorics are. Do we talk about global warming or climate change or climate chaos or extreme climate, etc. But I think there's less attention to the way that an accelerated climate change is impacting or altering the climate in which language operates. And so if we think of a word like glacial, does that mean interminably slow, or does that mean unacceptably rapid loss? So if a student is taking a glacial amount of time, is that 9 years or 9 months? It is being destabilized by this particular historical juncture. We think of the old figure, well-established figure of carving glaciers or carving icebergs. It's a kind of maybe it's a bit of Wisconsin in me, but a dairyland pastoral image transposed onto the poles of procreation as opposed to fracture, disturbance. There's nothing disquieting about that. And I was thinking the other day about an author that influenced me a great deal from an early age, Frank Kafka, and he has this great line, a book should be an ice axe that breaks open the frozen sea of the soul. And I think, well, now if I read that, I think, just hold the ice axe, just give the frozen sea a chance, And I have to drown in holidays in my head. That wasn't how I read it 20 years ago, And so I think the way in which these kinds of awareness change our relationship to language is part of what's going on in the literature and part of what's going on in the public discussion. And as you say, it is very historically inflected, and it does become generalized. And language changes under that pressure.
So Lars, the constellation of terms you put out for us, intimacy, nature, human nature, navigation, tools, possibility, I've actually been put in mind of another late 19th, early 20th century story that I think would be relevant here. And when I'm picking up on what Stephanie suggested, that we may be in a position to trouble human nature as our central object to say. I'm thinking of Jack London. I'm thinking of a story like To Build a Fire, or I'm thinking in which he's lost, right? He can't navigate his way through terrain. He can gradually no longer literally feel his body, but he's there with the dog, and we get into the dog's consciousness. The idea that the human is the person who knows how to solve this problem is actually one of the things that London calls into question, that actually the natural world, I think all his stories written from the perspective of animals are trying to trouble this distinction, may actually have many clearer ideas about how to solve this. And people sort of decenters the human from that story. And you suggested that we might need to think about phenomena to be solved by intergenerational work. I think we're on the verge of needing to think about interspecies work, where we think about ourselves on a planet in which, and this is not to say, some will say, we are simply one among many species and all species exist on a flat plane. But I think it's crucial, and I think literature has done it in the past and is doing it now, to decenter the human from the questions that we're trying to solve, even as we're trying to assign blame to the human and name it something like the Anthropocene. So there's an odd kind of tension about where the human should be as we move forward.
Great, thanks. And I'm going to turn over my students, but I just want to say I want to try to keep us super grounded here, that I feel like everything that we're saying has an implication for what literature is good for. And maybe if we even stick to climate change for a while, which I think obviously sort of the ringing topic that everyone's talking about in this room. I can really try to then, I think, that everything that we're saying has a real implication about what literature is good for, and if we can just take that extra step and say, okay, here's the relevance of thinking about what ideas that post-human are, for actually why we need to understand that in order to grapple with climate change successfully. If we can just encourage all of us to take that extra step that we're often so reluctant to take within the academy especially, and say, okay, why is that? Why do we need that? But I think that will definitely come up in the discussion. And I do think that we're all doing that, but I feel like sometimes it's we can take it one extra step from that being implied, that answer being implied. Is that reasonable to ask, or is that just me? Okay, so, yeah, Mark. Whatever, you can just talk about it.
I'm facing the wrong way. Well, first of all, I'd like to really thank the panelists for coming today. I think it's been really illuminating for all of us, especially in class and today. Our question really concerns itself with how, as a literary scholar or even as a writer, how you can connect yourself with a troubled audience or a broader audience. Our question really focuses on us as an audience, the younger generation. How do you make an important work, which many of you have very important works, how do you make it more accessible to an audience that's in many ways distracted or used to quick alerts in the news? How do you really take something that deserves longer attention and capture our imagination? Thank you.
I want a slight clarification of the question. So do you mean when you're teaching a longer work, how do you make that capture the imagination of the student, for instance, or when you're writing up your research, how do you?
When you're writing something like an article, or even when you're teaching it, I bet there could be some crossover between them. How do you?
And I think this is a pretty big question, but I'll just read it in a different wording.
Okay.
I don't know if that'll work. Right. So our original wording was, how can we broaden the affected audience of writing? In other words, how do you make important work more accessible to today's issue? So I guess if literature is useful, how can it be useful? Yeah.
It seems like two things, like more accessible, but also keeping in mind how distracted the audience often is.
Like, how do you get them to read it? And then how do you keep them reading it and not just put it down on one page?
First of all, they read for credit.
Yeah. And also in general.
No, absolutely. I mean, so often my double hat as a creative writer, so he teaches workshops in the MFA program in creative nonfiction, and we read outside writing and we read students writing. And what I sometimes get students to do is to write on the same subject with different venues in mind. So it could be a podcast, or it could be an op-ed piece, or it could be an essay, or it could be something footnoted. And I think part of the exercise, and it's something I've tried to do in my own career, is to recognize that you have a body of knowledge, but the narrative form, the amount of texture, the projected audience are variable. And there's a lot you can do with that knowledge. And I think sometimes I see people follow certain professional art where they're writing for the same audience all the time. And in that way, I learn a lot from students, like what bores them and what doesn't. And I may find something really interesting, and they say, well, why is that James Baldwin essay so long? You could have said that in 2 pages. Well, what does a 2-page version look like, and what does a 30-page version look like, and what does it look like in different platforms? So I really enjoy experimenting with that. And it's another way of saying to people, you think you have one body of knowledge, but actually if you multiply the audiences, you have multiple bodies of knowledge. And doing work with radio, doing internet stuff, installation stuff. I think literature is not an isolated skill, either creatively or interpretively, but bleeds into all these other forms. And I think that much of the most interesting work and the most engaged work is not done with I'm a literary person and then the rest falls away.
Yeah, I would largely agree with that and probably give a less eloquent version I know enough, I think, to teach it. And one of the things I have my students do in every class is to trace the life cycle of their favorite consumer item and write about it, and then present it to the class on it. So I ask them to do visual narratives using images. I ask them to write in their own voice. I ask them to do a kind of almost policy level analysis of a particular item. And I do, I train them to do that. Having them come into the classroom with an authorial voice tends to give or foster I think in all of us, more respect for authorship. And I too think that long-form fiction or creative nonfiction is one among many valuable forms. The microfictions in a project like the Future Post project are in some ways equally compelling and information-rich. I always ask my students what they read. A lot of them read fantasy serials. So that becomes part of the syllabus. Why? Well, in fact, many of those serials have very interesting insights in them about the possibilities of sustainable and adaptational futures, environmentally speaking. We do listen to radio podcasts. We do talk about fan fiction. So, if you put all of those kinds of forms in dialogue with, say, novels that were once serial fictions as well, I think re-entering those older long forms becomes more exciting and relevant. And I find that if you create a collaborative storytelling environment in a classroom too, where students are allowed and encouraged to offer their own opinions and experiential reactions to literature, the interest level is always high.
Two quick answers. I think Rob provides an excellent model in his own work for how, as a literary critic, you reach a broad audience by writing in different media and by writing for the op-ed pages and for reaching out of the classroom deliberately to find a broader audience. I think that's crucial. In my own classroom, one of the exercises I have students do is write about something that matters to them in the contemporary moment, a problem they want to solve in the voice of someone we've been reading in the class. So they have to inhabit that text and think about how that writer sees his or her world, and then try to see if they can do the same thing for something that matters to them. And if they can't, that says something. And if they can, that says something else. So, I mean, that's another way of getting students to think about how literature can help them think about the present.
Yeah, I'll just add really quickly is, because you folks all talk about teaching, and I don't primarily teach, so I do public communication, and I would say that one thing that interested me about the discussion last week is there were some folks who were encouraging us to really think about Facebook and Twitter and Instagram and these forms of communication that I personally have been very resistant to using or to even taking seriously, but saying, you know what, this is how a lot of people, and a lot of people your age especially, are really engaging in the world right now. We have to really think about how to commandeer these tools and use them. So think about, like, well, how would you use Facebook to talk about the importance of the tools of literary analysis for grappling with climate change? Because climate change is all over Facebook. Anybody who's on Facebook knows. Not a day is going to go by when you don't see something on climate change in your newsfeed. So, I think that's as resistant as I've been, as much as I would like everybody to toss their cell phone out the window right now, except for my app. It's not going to happen, right? It's inevitable. So I think it is a really important point. How can you actually take these forms seriously and figure out how to use them in substantive ways? If you want to address a question like, okay, let's use, literature is important here, right? Literary analysis is important here. How would you use Facebook and even Twitter, which I have yet to wade into, to do that? I think that's a really important question right now.
To jump in, I had a wonderful assignment that a student actually co-created with me last year, where students used Facebook to create a community of overlooked species that are common species that aren't considered charismatic, on Facebook. So each species had its own page, and they started talking to each other. And the page is archived in and recognizes us as companioned always by other life, I want to look at other species. What form would you put this in? And one of my students right away said, I want to put it on Facebook. And, you know, I take from your generation things that would never have occurred to me and might have even offended me, you know, if I hadn't seen how effective even Facebook can be as a knowledge archive and as a way of designing knowledge and as a way also of kind of tapping into that emotional intensity that literature also can generate.
Well, as I said, it's also a literary exercise in itself.
Yes, and we
it's
had
almost like modeling the usefulness of literature.
yeah, and we had to talk about, well, how do you use Facebook effectively? What kind of posts are interesting? What is literary about Facebook? Which becomes its own form of critique and an interesting one. Yeah. So I think we're gonna open up what we'd like to do is start with a question and then ask people to actually address that question for a little bit rather than just start a brand new question or a comment. It's fine. We would like to ask those. We have about 20 minutes. It's pretty good. Usually when we promise 30, we have 5, so I think actually we're doing okay. So we have enough time to probably address a few different questions or have a comment. We would ask people to try to be concise because so that we can get to several different threads. And Alan, you want to start us off? And if you can identify yourself as well, that'd be great.
Sure. I'm Alan Brad. I'm coming for story. Thanks for a great panel.
And speak up a little bit.
Sure.
What am I
I'd like to
saying?
ask if the panel would like to comment on the literariness of the science itself, and whether thinking about that as literature scholars is valuable in building bridges across disciplines. Rachel Preston has already mentioned as a great storyteller, but I think that Leopold and Muir and Darwin's tangled banks metaphor is one of the great literary metaphors that speaks across disciplinary boundaries. Do you think about the literariness of science?
Yeah, there was a lot, actually. There was a book that did very well called The Sound of a Wild Snail Eating. And it's about a woman who had a chronic illness and was bedridden, and somebody gave her a snail and a piece of moss or something, you know. And because she was pretty immobilized, she became more and more attentive to the snail's habit. And then when she started to research snail literature, and she would quote in this book long tracts of 19th century scientific writing about snails, and I was absolutely blown away by the lyricism, by the metaphoric content, by the cadences, and the wow, you know. So it took me back to like 19th century snail literature in the science. I thought I was just reading a small book, and I got kind of distracted. But it was something in the linguistic energy of those excerpts that made me think again about how charismatic so many of these scientific writers are, and how generative, and sometimes you get these, as you suggest, these nodal figures of speech that develop an independent life and are picked up popularly appearing in other forms of literature.
And it can sometimes go haywire, like this recent op-ed.
Yes.
That you sent out by Thomas Friedman. What was it you were talking about?
It was ISIS equals invasive species.
Yeah.
Very purist. But yeah.
It can be taken too literally.
Right, we can take it.
Do you want people in the audience to
Yeah,
comment?
I would like both the panel and the audience to maybe stay on this question or to try to sign and stuff. Would be great.
One thing that comes to my mind is that, you know, in recent years, I find myself teaching a lot of popular science writing. And so I've had to really start thinking about how does this work rhetorically? Why is it powerful? Why is it compelling? And think about it as a literary genre. This was not something that I started out doing when I was trained in a relatively conservative English department at Harvard back in the 90s. But this is a profoundly, I'm going to use the word impactful, forgive me, impactful mode of writing. And students respond to it very powerfully, and you can teach a piece on the mind of the octopus. It's a popular science piece from Orion magazine against a poem by someone like Les Murray that attempts to evoke the interior states of a particular animal. This was actually an exercise that I got from Stacey and Lima, who's not here with us, literally, but is here with the spirit. And people really start to respond to the ways in which these different modes give us a sense of the embodied point of view of another being. So popular science writing, I think, has a very strong place now in the literature classroom, certainly for people who are teaching environmental studies across these courses. Steve, did you want to add to this conversation?
I had something else.
Okay, can you just hang on to that for a minute? Do you have anybody else on science and literature who wants to make a comment? Or Rob?
Getting to this phrase, creative nonfiction. Why? If, at least the parliamentary is, boundary was set between creative nonfiction. Boundary between creative nonfiction and the imaginary.
Mm-hmm.
And you can be creative in how you arrange facts, and that's creative. That's a creative way to deal with nonfiction. But presumably, you're talking about something more than that. So how do you deal with the imaginary and creative nonfiction? What are the rules?
Yeah, I think the rules are going to vary tremendously from one author to another. And if you think of somebody like Rachel Carson in Silent Spring, the controversy around the fable at the beginning of the book, and whether that was opening it up to a general audience or putting off scientists because she has created a composite community. So within, creative nonfiction was a term that perhaps protests too much. But it was a pushback against this idea that nonfiction is not something, and it doesn't involve choices of craft. And so I think that, say, in Silent Spring, Carson was making a choice to create a composite town that didn't exist anywhere in America, but brought together certain emotional responses. And then somewhere else she gets into, deeper into the science. And there's an unevenness to the voice of that book, which I think is reflective of the difficulty of trying to cover herself for specialists, particularly as a woman, public science writer at the time when 1% of women science professors in the room, cover herself in relation to science, but also write in a non-specialist language. And I think similar challenges confront writers across the board. So it depends, are you trying to pull in a reader who has never heard of the Anthropocene and wants some dramatic account? How are you going to feel like you're not leaving a flank exposed for the specialist at the same time? And I think that's partly where the creativity comes in. Also, the creativity comes in terms of questions of dramatization, character, dialogue, scene setting. I mean, in the non-fiction field at large, there have been various people who have been hauled over the coals for, I think of Angela's ashes, saying, well, how can you remember what your mother said 60 years ago? And he said, well, those were the things, sort of things she said, okay? Now, maybe in a scientific context, that doesn't pass muster, but it does seem to me that there are certain books where people have done the research, done the expertise, and then also had to lose some of that expertise in order to gain an audience. And I think that's partly where the creativity comes in.
It's challenging, but a different boundary, the one where you lose the credentials of nonfiction because it's too generous to fiction.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think there are writers, a writer like W.B. Seewald, who's a German expatriate writer who lived in England in the late 20th century. He's a classic case where he would deliberately fudge the boundaries between fiction and non-fiction. So we have a lot of black and white photographs, most of which were documentary, but a couple of which were fiction. And he was trying to pull you along in a certain current, and then he would disturb that. And those disturbances were often powerful moments in that. So some people would call him a non-fiction writer, some people would call him a fiction writer.
I mean, one of the most celebrated practitioners of creative nonfiction invented the term is John McPhee, our very own John McPhee, who nobody would ever accuse of writing fictional. I mean, I think there's a big difference between creative nonfiction and fictional nonfiction, though, as Rob started out with, the rules vary a lot depending on the writer, but creative nonfiction is really just using the tools of fiction to write about nonfiction. So I think that, nobody would accuse John McPhee of writing bad geology, for example. He writes brilliantly about geology. And he would be, he's on the very extreme of you cannot make anything up. You cannot fudge anything. Everything has to be factual in your piece. So I don't think it's the...
But he still produces these diagrams of the choices he made and how to connect this with that as opposed to that with that. And I think that is the interesting part of it. You can still have the commitment to the factual enterprise, but he's making excursions in one direction as opposed to another.
Before we get away from science and literature, just because I think that we've been talking about how to use literature as a form of creative nonfiction, to talk about science fiction, there's also a discussion we don't have to have, but just want to throw it out there that you also need literature to understand science. No, I mean to understand how science is done. For scientists, to even understand how science is done, you have to understand that, why do scientists pick certain topics? How do they interpret their results? All of these can be shaped by the stories that people tell, which is not to delegitimize science in any way, but in some ways it's to help us make science more powerful and more honest, and for science to see its own assumptions. So, for example, when they first went, I forget who first went out to study. It was either about women or chimpanzees, and said, "Oh, it's a patriarchal society." Of course, it was a matriarchal society, but it took like a couple decades for people to realize that in fact it wasn't a patriarchal society, because the stories that people were bringing to this family really shaped the ways in which they did the sciences. I think there's also another whole set of questions about how literature can help us understand how we do science. Do you want anything on science? Yeah, Steve, do you want to have this?
This is one but one of the biggest problems is commented on everywhere, is that we're living in a society, because of the way in which the media has evolved and other forces, that is becoming increasingly polarized around all kinds of issues, and where perspective blocks our capacity to learn. All right? And so it seems to me that what is the value of literature in the environment? Well, one thing that only literature can do, and a lot of arts, is to impart knowledge from a perspective that is set in advance. All right. So when outdoor comes into your living room, and if you're a person who doesn't believe in climate change, all you see is someone from the other tribe, and there's all kinds of psychological work that shows that you can't hear. You can't hear his argument. You can't learn from him in any way. But in literature, of course, you can get to know the person, and the artist can get you to know the person before the person teaches you anything. And so it strikes me that I'd like to hear some comment on the value of literature in teaching people science from perspectives that are other than their own. Right? Literature is a way to diffuse what becomes, especially for climate change, which is an enormously controversial field and needs to be.
I mean, that was so well articulated. I'm not sure if we have comments on that.
I think it's brilliantly said. I mean, I would add something to it that's a little bit to the side of the comment, which is this new emphasis on collaborative storytelling, which of course does draw from the perspective that the person already has, but it puts that perspective into contact with other perspectives that might alter it and shape it. And I mentioned the Future Coast Project. Another one that you may be familiar with came out of Yale. It's called Slow Rise Stories, where two young men went around on an old beat-up motorcycle and interviewed people whose work has a great deal of dependency on the weather, and asked them to talk about weather patterns that they'd experienced over time within the context of this project. It was their project. And what you see, if you look at the videos of those stories, is people describe it, but a space of play where prejudicial or limited points of view begin to dissolve within the social. And what you suggest is another version, I think, of getting to know another mind that might be in opposition, at least ideologically, to your own, which literature also does very well. It gives us very complex characters, concretized, materially present to us, tangible, but not people we know until we actually enter fiction.
There's one more interesting turn on this topic, which is we're learning more and more about the neuroscience of reading. What happens in the brain when people become absorbed in a fictive story. I don't know this well enough to summarize it for you, but I think one of the things we discover is that the brain goes into certain kind of wave states where it's more open to fully inhabiting the fictional world that it's experiencing, and thus might be more available to taking on the knowledge or the opinions or the views of a character that they trust or are excited about. That notion of literature is escapist, which is usually a very negative connotation. What's actually the brain is making possible is for us to move from our present moment into another person's mind and experience what they're experiencing on the page. And I think that's profound. And that science is helping us understand how literature can do precisely the work that you're describing.
So literature helps us understand science, and science helps us understand. Sorry, keep going the same route.
Yeah, I think that one of the things I often tell student writers is not to waste their ignorance, not to waste the memory of their ignorance, because part of the power that you're talking about is for the reader to feel some kind of accompaniment through uncertainty, through discovery, rather than feel like on page 1, here's somebody in a camp, and you're going to be in this camp all the way to page 300. That's not a very compelling reason to keep reading. And I think that working from a place of ignorance allows you to get to places of discovery and creates that sense of accompaniment and defamiliarization, which is absolutely essential, I think, to breaking open the sense of, I read this book because I'm in that camp.
So I think we have time for one other conversation, and I think actually Steve had your hand up a long time ago.
But I mean, one theme that I hear all the way through is trying to figure out how to get the environment inside of one. Bill's talking about how the environment is outside, peripheral, and then last week Bill Cronin was talking about in the fable in Silent Spring of how actually nuclear radiation dust falling from the sky had been kind of prelude for understanding or getting an emotional involvement with DDT, also dropping from the sky. And I'm thinking of how climate is really a bloodless kind of problem. It's outside one. It doesn't really get in. There's no one really dying. It's not like a war. It's something that doesn't really affect us on the inside of us. And one thing I wrote recently, kind of by mistake, or just by accident, is I wrote a letter about the climate march was about to happen, and I was talking about how problems that once you start to try to solve a problem, once you reach out and try to get some help, that's when you feel better immediately. And that's what we aren't doing with climate change. We aren't trying, we aren't really taking that first step, that action to actually solve it. And I think accidentally I kind of got climate change inside of one, because you can experience that personally in terms of problems that one doesn't really try to solve, and just get worse and worse and worse. And that's sort of, I just saw that theme, Lars was talking about inner nature or human nature, and how do we get this outer environmental problem into our bodies? And I just wanted to make that comment.
I think, first of all, that you're right that climate is a sort of abstraction conceptually, whereas that media can do is to bring that experience to those who haven't, in fact, been on the front lines yet. Even that piece in the New York Times that I mentioned, which was both an obituary and a weather section, gave a very strong sense of, in a way, the foolhardiness that we've been talking about an inside and an outside. There's one man who was killed when a tree fell into the window or fell into his second-story apartment. This this kind of remakes the idea of inside and outside. It kind of gives you a new sense of what urban violence might be, for instance, and where agency resides, and how, in fact, deeply vulnerable we are to climate effects. I read that piece with a sense of it as a work of literature insofar as it really forced me to think about a set of actions and actors that because of the way that they were interacting, changed my own sense of the sort of vulnerability of my body. You can think about more extreme examples from the Pacific Island nations that are literally losing territory and sovereignty because of sea level rise, and there have been some really powerful documentaries about those people that I hope move others to feel climate inside of them. Anybody in the audience have a comment or question about that? Making climate personal, bringing it into your own life, your own body? Time for one more comment. Who wants the last word?
So I think, yeah, when we talk about social climate, it's very big in a lot of senses. It's big and powerful, it's perhaps distant, it grasps everything up, but kind of being far away. I think it's bigger. The radius has to be bigger, whatever it is far away. But I think, in a sense, I think sometimes it's easy to lose sight. I know we were focusing on climate change, but I know it can be frustrating for a lot of people to only think about climate change when we hear environmental problems. There are a lot of very present, issues with toxicity, very, felt, like environmental problems that are felt deeply by people as results of industrialization, as results of, chemical warfare and things like that. And I think, one perspective that I think can be very helpful but hasn't been brought up a lot is how can we address directly these perhaps more viscerally experienced problems, and along the way that will help us navigate climate change better, because we are addressing issues that are integral parts that affect climate change, but by approaching them in more concrete ways. And I think
I think that's a great question, and there is definitely a risk that because climate change is such a gargantuan issue, that it absorbs all the energy that we're directing towards environmental futures. And I think one of the interesting things that's happening around Chinese environmental protests, and I think 2012 there was something like 55,000 environmental protests in China. But because of the catastrophic air quality in many of the larger cities, you've got a convergence of two issues: immediate health and long-term climate. And that's where a lot of the most effective and most creative activism on all platforms has been taking place. And it's also an issue where it's harder for people to retreat from. And obviously there are, zoning laws and so forth that make certain communities more vulnerable than others, but it's a national, or it's a collective issue. And so there, it's a question of asthma and lung cancer and relatively short-term threats that also is consequential for the big issue. So I think the kind of leverage you get from the relatively short-term issue is absolutely critical.
Do you think literature can help us explain why climate change. So not only because it's so urgent, but the ways in which it plugs into established narratives, just like we were saying, literature can help us ask, why do scientists ask the questions they ask? Why do people focus on some environmental problems more than others? That's maybe a question that literature can help us explain.
No, I was going to say, but this could also be an answer to the question you raised. How do we get it into our bodies? And maybe we get it in through this adjacent issue that people feel deeply die from, that they see as connected to the bigger picture, short-term pain and then the longer-term picture. I mean, that may be the way it would have to, maybe the way it might most productively happen. And literature's capacity for creating empathy in readers might need to start on those scales, or at least work on those scales in addition to the bigger scale.
Well, the scales are interlocking in interesting ways too, always, and I think that cross-scalar kind of writing has been the most interesting and effective. I think about something like Suzanne Pimentel's book, Body Toxic, which on the one hand is about specific ways in which her reproductive